Hello and welcome. This is Jim Karp with Rehmann, and I have Jennifer here, Mark, as well as Jessica. Folks, can you introduce yourselves?
Sure, thanks. I'm Jennifer Poplava, and I'm an attorney at the law firm Mika Meyers in Grand Rapids.
Hey, Jim, pleasure to be with you. Good afternoon, Mark Spock. I am Director of Security and Support Services with Rehmann Technology Solutions.
Hi, Jim. I'm Jessica Dory. I'm a principal in charge of the Technology Risk Management Group at Rehmann.
Okay, folks, and we're glad you guys are here today. A hot topic. People are working remotely. The pandemic's changed everything, and the clients that are out there are experiencing different things. What are you seeing out in the field today from a remote perspective, and what advice do you have for our clients that are out there?
Absolutely, Jim. Well, I will start on that side and really talk about the risks that we're seeing out there with the remote workers and everybody shifting to this new normal of working remotely. So one of the big things that we've seen is the increase in phishing attacks that are out there and the different tactics that the hackers are using out there. So they're taking full advantage of the pandemic and of the situation that we are in. So there have been a number of different tactics that have been used to essentially try to get workers to click on links or open attachments that they shouldn't have in these emails. That then essentially gives them a foothold into these environments. So that's a big risk that we've been seeing out there. Another big risk we've been seeing is with the quick shift to remote working, a lot of organizations didn't take the time and do proper due diligence in making sure that their solution was secure and deployed in a secure manner. So, for example, a lot of organizations don't have multi-factor authentication, on their remote connections. So whether that's on their VPN or any other remote connections that they have into the environment. That is a huge risk because we know that users use insecure passwords. So we know that, they are using traditional dictionary words, things such as seasons and the year, everything along those lines. And so if your users are using these non-complex passwords, it makes it much easier for the outsiders to be able to compromise those remote connections if you don't have multi-factor authentication in place. So those are some of the big risks that we've been seeing out there related to the pandemic and the remote workforce. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk about some of the security measures that can be implemented to protect yourself against these.
You bet. Thank you, Jessica. And, really what we're starting to see with a lot of the companies is this came on so quickly. Many of them, weren't prepared to pivot. And so in a lot of cases, they were, going down the basement and pulling some old hardware out and pulling some things out just to get their people back to work. And, I'm actually familiar with one entity that did that. They had just completed a Windows 7 retirement and migrating all their workstations to Windows 10. And they really had no choice but to go downstairs and grab those units and pull them back out. And at that point, you're kind of introducing some risk back into the environment because now you have end-of-life operating systems in play, and you're probably not going to be adhering to the security best practices at that point. So one of the other things we saw as well is, a lot of companies that turned on remote desktop services externally. Many employees needed a way to get in. They needed to access their applications, continue to be effective within the company. And so they made these connections available outside the firewall. Well, attackers look for that. The threat actors are looking for ways to get into corporate environments and try to brute force attack those remote desktop connections and try to break in. So it's really important that we're closing off that RDP connection. We really don't want to expose that out in front of the firewall. We really want to use a VPN connection, which really gets me into my next point, is making sure that we do have that VPN connection in place. And it's not only just having the VPN connection, but it's also making sure it's configured properly. Because what we're talking about is users that are working from home that are potentially clicking on things, or, their machine potentially gets compromised. And then they're able to piggyback on that VPN connection and actually get back into the company. So we want to think about how that VPN connection has been configured. We want to make sure it only has access to the resources that are needed by the user. And then also, it also makes sure that your users are adhering to your web content filtering policy. One of the other things that many organizations may consider is deploying a remote agent to help make sure that that web content filtering and that DNS filtering is always protected on that endpoint. That endpoint can travel to a number of different locations. And one of the things that's really changed for IT is it's not always just within our four walls anymore. It has now gone mobile. And so we want to be very aware of that and make sure that we have the protections in place on the endpoint. Jessica did a great job talking about multi-factor authentication. Just stress that again. If you do have those business applications or critical services that you're using, such as VPN, we want to make sure that we have that multi-factor authentication in place. We see a lot of business email compromise for like Office 365 and Office business applications because we don't have that multi-factor authentication in place. So we're seeing wire transfer fraud and a number of different things as a result of not having MFA. And Jessica also mentioned password hygiene. We want to make sure that we're doing good best practices with how we manage our passwords. We don't want to be using them across multiple services and across multiple websites. So we want to make sure that we're using good, strong passwords. And if you have to, use a password manager to keep track of those passwords that you have, because that's often what causes us to cheat a little bit and make those passwords easy to remember because management is so difficult. One of the other things to also consider from a protection standpoint is what we call least privilege. And this is really just making sure that our end users that are out there in the field working from home, that they only have the access to their PC that they really need. And so if they do make the accident of actually clicking on a malicious link or clicking on something harmful for their machine, well, now they don't have admin privilege over that computer, and that threat or that exploit can't deeply root itself into the system. So it's really, really important that we take a look at those least privilege models and remove that admin access if it's not required on the system. Another protection mechanism that we can talk about is what we call endpoint detection and response. This is a more advanced form of technology, and it's really looking to deal with some of these threats that have become much more advanced than your traditional antivirus or malware engine is going to be able to detect. So the endpoint detection and response engine is looking for behaviors that occur on the system that was not initiated by the user. It's able to quarantine that attack, and in many cases, it can roll the system back prior to when the attack occurred and really sanitize that system and get it back into a healthy order. So having a good, strong endpoint detection and response in place, as well as having that firewall enabled, is going to make sure that we have a strong position on that endpoint. And we want to make sure we're scanning it. We want to make sure that we're keeping that machine clean, and we always know its health position. One of the big things that's really difficult for many businesses is that a lot of things have moved outside of our walls. So how do we patch that system? How do we make sure it's still adhering to all of our policies? Well, that becomes a little bit more of a challenge. So we want to make sure that we're rebooting our PC, that we're still keeping up with those Windows updates, that we're patching those third-party applications. It's very, very important that that hygiene continues and stays in place because zero-day vulnerabilities are always being released. There's always bugs and fixes that are being released by manufacturers. So we want to make sure that we're staying on top of that stuff. And just like if you were in the office, if you walked away from your PC, one of the great examples I like to give is if you're a gal, you probably wouldn't walk away from your purse. Same thing here. You don't want to walk away from your PC without locking that PC before you walk away. You know, you never know who's around or who might be looking at potentially sensitive data. So we want to keep those same hygienes and those same practices and lock your PC before you walk away. And then just a couple more things to mention is really backing up the data, making sure that the data that you're producing as a remote worker is being backed up somewhere, either within corporate systems or in the cloud. If you were to lose your endpoint due to theft, if it were to crash or fail, or if you were to, in fact, suffer some type of a ransomware attack, you want to make sure that you have a good backup position and that you've not lost critical or sensitive data. And then lastly, as an organization, it's really about security awareness training. We want to keep up with our education of our users. We want to make sure that they are educated on the threats that we're seeing out there in the attack landscape, because that's just going to make sure that you're protecting yourself. Oftentimes we do a great job from a technology perspective, putting a lot of controls in place, putting a lot of technology in place to protect us. But really at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the user. We have to continue to involve the human OS factor and make sure that we're training our staff really, really well.
These are all really excellent points, Mark. And when I am contacted by clients and they ask me what technical security measures they must put in place, I tell them that it's complicated, and I certainly send them to experts like you to talk about all those options. The legal landscape is even more complicated because in the United States and in Michigan, we don't have a law that specifically requires a business to take specific certain security measures. All the guidance that is generally given is that you have to be reasonable in the security measures that you're taking. And so that what that means changes from business to business, depending on what type of information is collected and what your business is doing with that information. So what I like to tell clients when they're analyzing which of the solutions that you've just described they should be implementing for their company, I tell them that they need to understand what data they are handling and what laws might be applying to their data. For example, if they are collecting information about California residents, then they are going to need to comply with the laws of California, which require that you take some additional steps to protect that information that wouldn't necessarily apply if you were just collecting information about Michigan residents. So having that understanding of what you actually have and what you're doing with it is really essential and a really important first step before you analyze what steps you need to take, what technical measures you need to take. And after a business has an understanding about what data they are controlling and the level of technical controls that they want to start using, that it's then important to work through what administrative controls might be appropriate for that business in order to implement this in their business. And Jessica, what are you seeing as to administrative controls?
Sure, Jennifer. Yeah. So from an administrative control perspective, there's a lot of things that organizations should consider. Really revolving around access control is a huge one. Making sure that your employees, have the appropriate access for their job function and they don't have any additional access that isn't required above and beyond that, because that could potentially open up the organization for fraud to occur. You should also make sure that a process is in place for controlling access. So approving the access, setting up the access. If access has to be changed, it should follow that process. You should have a timely process in place for any removals of access, whether that is an employee that's terminated from an organization or an employee that's leaving and going to a different job role within the same organization. You should stay on top of those because you want access to be appropriate at all times for their job function and to not run into any issues where you don't have the proper segregation of duties and access limits in place. From an administrative perspective, that again, focusing around access control, also, staying on top of that access. So regularly reviewing your access to your network, your applications, everything like that. Again, that really centers around that administrative control around access. So I'll let Mark jump in here with some thoughts from a technical perspective.
You bet. I mean, when we talk about some of that access control and file permission access, those are very positive conversations that we have to consider. It kind of gets back to what I mentioned previously, which was, the least privilege model. Again, it's only giving the access that the user needs to do their function, to do that job. And so if we can remove that administrative privilege from the workstation, then we are significantly limiting the threat vectors that are possible against that endpoint. So it's really, really important that we remove that admin access where we can. And one of the big things that I also encourage many companies to consider, especially if they do have that IT function internal to their business, is make sure that their admins have separate accounts. Many businesses that we walk into, we find that the IT administrators are domain admins on the network, and they're using the same account to do email, to do regular web transactions. and there's no separation of duty, and there's no separation of audit logging. So it's very, very important that we have that separation. We want to have one account that we use only for administrative access and administrative control, and our base login, our base user account is just a normal account. And then also from a technical control perspective, we want to make sure that our endpoints are adhering to that control. So our policy says we're doing something, we have our administrative control. What does it look like when we're actually implementing the technical control? Is that technical control, is it matching what we said we were going to do in our policy and how we're doing our change management? And then, you know, really there's a big shift that's happening within the space, and it's really moving toward more of a zero trust model. And this is really a model where, you know, back in the older IT days, you know, it was kind of the castle and moat. You know, I have my kingdom, I have everything inside, I trust everything that's inside of my kingdom, and I have my moat with my alligators on the outside, I have my perimeter, and I am safe and I am secure. Well, the problem has been is that a lot of our data, a lot of our services, a lot of our operations have been decentralized. We have a lot of cloud, we have a lot of SaaS-based applications that now support our businesses. And so the castle and moat model has really gone away. And so we really have to start moving toward a zero trust model, which basically says, I don't trust you until I have verified. Even if you are a workstation that's joined to my domain and you're under my policy, I'm going to make sure that you're adhering to my policy. I'm going to make sure that you pass my security checks. And then I'm going to allow you to talk to my systems and talk to my applications. So there really needs to be more of a shift, especially because of the decentralization of data, that we start looking at that zero trust model. But obviously, whenever we talk about these controls and we put them in place, there's always a legal perspective to that. So Jennifer, I'll let you kind of speak to that.
Thanks. And it's very true that access controls are an essential way to secure information and data and to reduce the likelihood of intrusion. Where some people stumble and fall down is in the consistent application of those access controls. And one of those things is upon changes of employment. So if you are assigning different roles to different employees and either one of those roles changes or that employee is terminated, it is very important that the proper steps are then taken to restrict their access after they are terminated. So we generally encourage our clients to have a termination checklist that their human resources individual or department uses to make sure that they go through and make all the necessary changes to access permissions upon change in employment, because failure to do so provides a vulnerability that you don't really anticipate. If you've got a person whose employment was terminated and they feel a little upset about it, and you don't terminate their access, then they have a full window to get into your system and cause some trouble. And that's a problem that can be easily avoided if you do follow your systems. It makes it very important to be sure that you are taking the steps as your organization to make sure that you're prioritizing these security issues to make it work company-wide.
And one of the things that I'll actually mention there, Jennifer, and you made some great points there, is that even from a technology perspective, we're seeing, you know, where we have these applications where we can add in multi-factor and we can add in all of these applications, and many businesses are using these SaaS-based applications. When we talk about removing that access from the employees, things have become a little bit more tricky. We've got a lot of systems to touch. We've got a lot of things to verify to make sure that we've actually done the job properly. And so that's where like technologies like single sign-on come into play, because now I don't have to touch so many systems, and at the click, I can make sure that I've removed access from all of my business applications that user has access to. So we're actually seeing even more technical shift to kind of accommodate this a little bit more, because we have to have a seamless way to make sure that we've removed that access from that employee.
Okay, all good information here today. So we first started basically talking today and saying, if you're going to go remote, you got to make sure that you have your passwords and a lot of the technical aspects of everything, as well as then Jennifer, you jumped in and talked about making sure that you have the right information, you know what you need to protect, as well as then at the tail end of saying, if people are gone, we need to get them eliminated. So good information here today on how to set yourself up to be successful working remotely. Next time, we're going to talk again along the lines of remote, and we'll be talking policy procedures and making sure that all of the infrastructure behind the scenes, all the little ticks and tacks are taken care of to make sure everything's successful. Thank you, everybody, for your time today, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.